Charlotte, I will put my question to you. A warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us live from Moscow. How is Russia viewing Prime Minister Modi's visit to Moscow, and especially what Prime Minister Modi has said to President Putin today on the Ukraine war, that no solution can be found on the battlefield?
It's interesting, Prime Minister Narendra Modi making those comments just before he and Vladimir Putin went in for their official talks. The two leaders, of course, met 4 to 5 hours on Monday night in what seemed to be very congenial circumstances, chatting, walking around the official presidential residence, which is on the outskirts of Moscow, sharing cups of tea. And we understand that that was a very frank and open discussion, which Narendra Modi also described as being respectful. Well, we heard him talk today saying that the future can only be peace, and talking about the fact that hearts burst when we see innocent individuals losing their lives, particularly children. There's a suggestion he was referring to the incident at the Children's Hospital in Ukraine yesterday, which Ukraine has said was a result of a Russian attack. The Russian MOD has rejected that, saying it does not target civilian institutions. What it says that was the result of is the anti-Ukrainian air missiles faltering. But moving on from that, what we also heard from Narendra Modi is the fact that India is there ready to do whatever it can to make peace happen. And we know for the last 2.5 years, India has been very clear about this. It was not going to cow down to what the West wanted it to do and to condemn Russia. But it has said time and time again that peace is the only solution to this conflict. And Narendra Modi also saying that he was buoyed by hearing the openness and frankness of President Putin, and by the fact that President Putin himself has said that he wants to see peace between these two brotherly nations. But let's be clear, that dialogue has been a difficult way coming, mainly to the fact that Ukraine has refused now for over a year to negotiate with Russia without its conditions being met. Ukraine has actually banned outright any negotiations with Russia. Russia was not invited to the recent summit that was held in Switzerland. India, of course, did send a representative, not Narendra Modi, but then India refused to sign the final communique from that summit itself. And there is a long history now of how perhaps Russia could find itself able to trust the West again, given that the Minsk agreements, which were signed in the last 10 years or so, this is with former leaders of France and Germany, were all signed in a bid to find an end to the conflict in what was then the East, create these now 4 republics that have voted to join Russia in the last year. But we now know, since the outbreak of conflict in February 2022, that Angela Merkel and François Hollande, those former leaders of those countries, actually say that they were using the Minsk agreement as a biding time to be able to arm Ukraine to make it a stronger nation in case there ever was a war with Russia. We also know with the sanctions imposed on Russia in the last 2.5 years, and the continued supply of weaponry as well as military intelligence to Ukraine, that it's pretty hard for Russia perhaps to trust the West to be the negotiators to bring the two sides to the table. However, India occupies a very different position. Given that it's a trusted strategic partner now with Russia, it's also a trusted strategic partner with many countries in the West, those old colonial ties to the UK, but also ties to the US as well. It could see itself perhaps in prime position alongside other countries such as Turkey to be the ones that could possibly bring the two sides together without preconditions and potentially thrash out a deal that could have been signed back in April 2022.
Right.
Had it not been, both sides said this, scuppered by the then British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson.
Well, as you mentioned, India is one country that has repeatedly reached out to both sides and said that it is willing to play any role, possible to broker peace. Unfortunately, the war has now gone on for over 2 years, and Prime Minister Modi did tell President Putin in fact, even 2 years ago, that this is not an era of war. But I want to discuss another issue with you quickly, moving away from the Ukraine war, Charlotte, that, even though India and Russia have enjoyed this friendship for a very long time and are trusted partners, there is a growing disquiet and unease here in New Delhi over Russia's deepening ties with China for reasons that you can understand. We have an unresolved border dispute with China, and of course, there is the issue of China's growing expansionism in our region. The question I want to ask you is the Kremlin sensitive about New Delhi's concerns vis-a-vis China?
I think the Kremlin is going to be open to listen to any concerns that India has, and that's just because the relationship is so friendly, it's so frank, and it's so honest. When you talk about those issues, you mentioned there the border issues, but then there is, of course, the issue on the Indo-Pacific, and this is with India joining up in the Quad with those other countries, Australia, the US, and Japan, to potentially counter any threat it could see from China in that area. Let's be clear. Russia also has an incredibly important economic and political relationship with China too. I mean, we saw in the recent visit of Vladimir Putin to Beijing that this is a partnership, he said, with President Xi, without any limits. But what we can also take from that is that Russia wants to have these good relations with China. It also sees these great relations with India as being strategically important. So perhaps on this stage, Russia could be the one that could step in and try and bring those two sides together to create essentially a strong bloc on the Asian continent that, given the dying hegemony of the US, could be incredibly pivotal for the future that's to come, and to give India and other members of the global South a voice that they have not had on the world stage.
Okay, final question, Charlotte, before we let you go. India and Russia have long-standing defense ties. India has also now emerged as a major buyer of Russian oil despite the Western sanctions imposed on Moscow. But in terms of trade, there is a lot left to be desired. There's a huge trade imbalance, in favor of Moscow, and that doesn't quite work for New Delhi. Do you believe that when the two leaders and the two delegations sat down to talk today at the Kremlin, this issue figured prominently, and are they thinking about how this can be addressed going forward?
Yes, absolutely. You're talking about that huge trade imbalance. I think it's currently 65 billion US dollars trade between the two countries, and of that, India's exports are only around 4 billion, so a very small amount of that. But let's be clear, one of the big issues in trying to address that has been this issue of the rupee to ruble mechanism. The rupee is not held as a currency reserve in many countries around the world, so it's not easily changeable. And there's also been restrictions on countries in terms of taking their capital investment out of India. I know that the Central Reserve in India has started to lift those restrictions, and I think it's pretty clear that Russia is open to more Indian exports coming into the country. We know India wants to perhaps ramp up that in terms of pharmaceutical exports as well as services. But Russia understands that India wants to see more of a trade balance. That may be something that cannot be addressed immediately, but both leaders are aware of it, and Russia knows that to keep this relationship getting stronger and stronger, this needs to be addressed. So possibly those changes that we've seen with the lifting of restrictions, we'll see more investment into India from Russia, and then potentially by Russian consumers. And I certainly think that a visit like this, as large scale as it's been, as well covered as it's been, and the reception that Narendra Modi has had here in Moscow, will certainly open up the eyes of the Russian public to just how important this relationship is.
Certainly an important relationship, and India does hope to see more investment from Russia going forward. The trade imbalance issue certainly needs to be addressed, as does the payments issue that has in fact held up trade in many ways between the two countries thanks to Western sanctions. Charlotte, thank you so much for joining us from Moscow and giving us a lowdown on the last 2 days of this very important visit by Prime Minister Modi to Russia. Thank you.